Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My colleague Tim Eyre and I are really excited to be sharing some ideas with you on managing disruptive compliance challenges in medical devices. You might ask, what do we mean by that? What we're talking about are the changes in regulations that cause us to do so many different compliance initiatives, and how disruptive that is, and how can we make that an easier process. Before we go into detail, I'd like to just introduce ourselves. And if you could advance the slide, Tim. We are with Integrated Project Management. We're experts in life science industry, project and program leadership and consulting. We work with companies, small startups, through Fortune 100 companies, and work across the country. We have 7 offices, 3 in the West Coast, 2 in the Midwest, and 2 in the East Coast. We provide a number of services to medical device and other life science companies, regulatory and quality, product development, change management, business technology, and other things. I'm a consultant, a principal consultant out of the Chicago office. My background is in medical devices, in diagnostics and in pharmaceuticals. And my colleague Tim Eyre is the director of the Minneapolis office, and his background is in medical devices and in quality and quality systems. So let's get started. What do we mean by disruptive challenges? So a couple of these I've highlighted on this slide. The changing landscape, as I mentioned before. And a couple of prime examples are things we're dealing with right now. EU MDR, for example, or EU IVDR, large compliance changes that are requiring us to do a lot of work to meet the new standards. It could also be things that are part of our regular business, perhaps a product failure and a recall, or regulatory audits and findings that cause us to go and do changes to how we handle our quality system. These all have a big impact, and the impacts impact our staff overload, causes people to lose focus, can delay critical activities that were planned for the year, such as product launches. It can impact other regions besides the specific area where the compliance is changing. And so these impacts really can distract our organization, and our goal is to reduce the amount of disruption. So there is a silver lining to this, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what we do internally in our company can impact how much disruption there is. There's resistance to change. Let's face it, we're bound on compliance processes and doing things the right way, and so we're really hesitant to change how we do things. It could be that the new regulations are not clear when they're introduced, and we're waiting to hear how things are going to work out. For example, when MDR came in, a large change from the MDD, and those changes, we looked at those and we go, well, what does it mean? What is the new role for the notified body? How does UTMed fit into this? What about the new clinical requirements and so on? And so companies had a tendency to hold off for a while and wait and see what happened. Once the dust cleared, they would pick it up. But it's critical to move as quickly as possible to not lose that time. And that time can be key for helping to set your strategy, as well as starting to develop your plans for how you're going to undertake this activity and not have it disrupt your normal operations. Another aspect could be pre-existence compliance gaps. For example, maybe a product family needs some work before it's really fully compliant with the current regulation, and now you've got even more work to do because of the new regulation. So as I mentioned a minute ago, we can look for benefits from these changes. And what I mean by that is we have to go through certain changes to how we do our compliance, how we manage our processes to meet the new standard. maybe by looking beyond, we can identify ways of creating greater efficiencies, or maybe doing things in a way that's not as expensive, doesn't take as much time. So adoption of new tools and processes, maybe some better systems. Very often these things are things we wanted to do anyway, and we kept putting them off because there were other activities we needed to do first. So this gives us an opportunity to look for benefits. These benefits are really important from the change management standpoint. They're really the motivating factor for how we make changes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to share with you a couple of examples of benefits, just to get you thinking about how that really works. For example, UDI. The intention there was to create global product traceability, particularly implantable products, and so on. There's a lot of information that needed to be gathered to become compliant with UDI. And by using that information in different ways, you can actually improve your quality surveillance of your products. You can use some of that data potentially for market analytics and understand how your products are doing in different regions. So there's value to the outcome as well as just becoming compliant. MDR is an ongoing process that people are struggling with now. One aspect of MDR is the labeling process and labeling changes. And in order to do that effectively and efficiently, it's good to replace manual processes and scattered data sources for labeling and go to a single source of truth system for managing your labeling data. That can have a huge impact on efficiency and the effectiveness of your labeling going forward. So investing to help with MDR can actually pay out over the long haul. Third example, MDSAP. The intention there was to create more efficient, less burdensome regulatory oversight. But that process literally allows you to create one way of doing your business to be compliant in multiple regions. And that's a huge advantage. So our goal here is to reduce the disruption. How we do that is, here's a few ideas. One thing that is key is having the right leadership, having experienced people that understand how to navigate cross-functionally, cross-divisions, cross-company, and potentially even outside the company with CMOs, CROs, other outsourcing partners that you work with, and people that can make these kinds of change happen in the least disruptive way possible. So that's a key goal, key driver here. Having an early warning system, regulatory monitoring of the landscape to say, these are things that are coming, and here's the likelihood they're going to happen, and starting to plan your strategy early can help you be less disruptive when you actually have to make the changes. Planning early for change management is important, and we'll talk more about that. Risk planning, mitigation strategies, and so on. All part of creating good plans, including regulatory in your business strategy and priority setting so you get the funding to do the job. For something large like MDR and IVDR, large, long-term, multi-year programs, you need to have the funding early so you can get started. And product portfolio management can come to play. For example, on those examples, the likelihood that you're going to be able to do everything you want to do, it may not be there. You may have to cut some corners. Maybe you want to pull some products from Europe and put out a new version later. And so you can decide from portfolio rationalization where you want to put your investment. So the goal is to create a successful environment where we can do change. And as I said before, motivating your team by showing the benefit of the change is a driver to help get people on board, to get them working with the program and finding creative ways to fit it within their workflows. We talked about a lot of the things in the organizational capability, One thing I'd want to mention is the partnership between quality and regulatory. Those functions are really two sides of the same coin, and it's important that they're brought in early to help with the strategy, because so much of the work and the challenges are really part of that quality and regulatory process. The environment in your company, are you ready for change? Do you have built-in flexibility so that you can do creative things and do them without disrupting all your normal workflows? That's important. So we talked about change management. Let's go into a little detail now. Managing change is a process of not just doing the requirements, but it's also getting the outputs that are desired and making them part of your normal operations. And that's really capturing the benefits. So we break it down here into three pieces: assessing the impacts, strategy and planning, implementing the change. In terms of assessing for impacts, stakeholder awareness is really important. People need to understand this is coming, they need to be thinking about it, and you also need to work with them to understand the impacts on their functions, on their people, on the quality system and processes you have in place. It's the processes you didn't think about that can come back to delay you later. And of course, planning for budget and resources is important. Next, you use that information to help develop a strategy. How can you go about this? Do you need to go external to get additional resources? Do you have to reassign people? Do you have to change your priorities? The change leadership is key, as I mentioned before, and you develop plans and try and test them out. There'll be whiteboard exercise, so you have to test them out to make sure that you're not putting too much burden on your organization and delay critical processes and critical goals. And then implementing the change. So here we're talking communication, and it's communication throughout the entire process of change management, making sure that people know the importance of it, that they understand their role and how they can help, and actually engaging them to make them more enthusiastic about it by showing them the benefit on the other side. You want to engage your key influencers and early adopters because they can help pull people along, and that will help you with the change. So you want to build an adaptive organization, transforming from reactive to a proactive approach. And we've created an acronym for that, how to create an adaptive organization. We call it RADAR. And it really sums up the ideas that I have talked about. So monitoring your regulatory landscape to understand as early as possible what's happening, how is that going to impact the organization. And then building adaptive strategies using the benefit of your effective leaders, understanding the impacts and planning this out in a strategic fashion, developing the plans, specific plans for how you're going to do it, who's going to do what, and how this is going to all happen. Actively implement, keeping your focus on the strategy, and ensuring visibility and communication throughout. And then getting a successful first approval from your regulators. So with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague Tim, who's going to talk in some more detail about some of these aspects, give you some examples, and also talk about what happens when things go a little slower than you anticipated. And Tim.
Well, thank you, Scott. What I'd like to do is just take a second just then to kind of summarize advantages of an adaptive organization that Scott just talked about. So early warning, right? Just extended vision, being able to see further on the horizon, the opportunity to identify the work to be done, the scope, size, etc. earlier on. This enables you to get your management involved and aware, and then get the support from them, whether it's resource or finance. When that's the case, you get to integrate it into your normal portfolio, right? That minimizes disruption to normal operations because it becomes part of your normal operations. And then the projects run like any other project in the portfolio, and they're resourced to manage the scope by the target completion. Each of you have probably in some way been involved with the MDR. I think that this has been a broad-reaching work effort within most companies. And on the screen, you can see some of the big ticket items that were part of really transitioning from MDD to MDR. Now, we had quite a long sight, right? At least 3 years, if not more, if you were kind of paying attention before it became active, you had quite a line of sight. An adaptive organization took the opportunity to really get a sense of the size and the work involved, right? All the resources and scope. And this enabled them really to complete this by the due date, but it also gave them some business benefits because they were able to look at their portfolio and understand which things should be transitioned over to MDR, and being able to do that well so their portfolio of products was not impacted. Now, being adaptive certainly sounds great, right? Being able to do that well and get everything into your portfolio, but what happens if that's not your organization yet? Or maybe it is your organization, but you're caught by surprise. Well, in that case, organizations kind of switch into a different mode. It's much more reactive. Lots of times people call this crisis mode. It tends to be fast-paced, often a bit disorganized, and it tends to pull in whoever you can, but often the A players. And of course, why not pull in the A players? They're the folks who typically get the things done. So you're going to pull those folks in. Now, when you have crises, there's impacts, and you can see it affects a number of the spaces in the organization. We'll talk about that for just a second. From an operational perspective, you're pulling these A players, right? You're reallocating resources, and that can disrupt your ongoing operations and projects. The projects that those folks came off end up being often delayed. Now, that means your portfolio becomes a little bit unpredictable. And if some of those projects are revenue generating projects, then your revenue forecast is at risk. And of course, that's really paramount to most business when that happens. Now, there's another aspect that often people don't think about, but it becomes really important over time. During a crisis, often communication breaks down, right? Because the organization isn't used to managing in crisis mode. And that leads to confusion, often to fear. And there's a negative impact on personnel. When folks are reassigned, it not only affects them, but the project that they left. And often there's stress, decay in the morale of the folks. And if you operate in crisis mode long enough, or with multiple crises, sometimes you lose key employees who just want to move to a less stressful environment. The other thing that comes in is impact on reputation. In the case of the EUMDR, if you're started late and in crisis mode and you're pressing in on your regulatory bodies to really help you through this, that may create strain on that relationship. And then there's scrutiny. Certainly, if you're moving fast, maybe your quality is not quite as good as it normally would be if you had been in an adaptive organization. And so with the quality drops, more scrutiny from regulatory body. If projects are delayed, especially the revenue, investors start picking up a little bit more scrutiny there. And then, of course, the folks who are inside the organization, they're seeing all the dirty laundry and trying to determine whether they want to stay there or move on. Now, in the case of the EUMDR, if you ended up being in reactive mode, you see the little guy at the top of the screen. If you started somewhere in the middle, you have an enormous amount of work to get done. But what happened actually for many companies is that they found out that they couldn't get all the work done by the initial due date. And they had to make some portfolio decisions that they wouldn't have made had they had more time, like sunsetting products or having to recertify under MDD instead of transitioning. So being in that case sometimes forces your hand into decisions you didn't intend. Now, sometimes these things happen, and the question is, what's your best chance of recovery when you're late? Well, you have some chance to recover. The key elements of that are, first, you have to triage the situation. You really need to understand what you're up against, the scope of it and size, because you need to bring that in, get management support, management alignment, and that's in resources and finance. And then change management. Really need to think about change management in an urgent situation like that. And you need to be able to bring everyone into alignment. Using change management processes enables you to do that. Communication, key, real time, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And finally, you really need people who can operate in this crisis or reactive mode. They have to be used to that. So if you have a kind of a tiger team inside that's used to that, then you deploy them. If not, you might seek outside help from another organization who is used to and has processes for working in these environments. Now, we found from our experience helping some organizations through crisis is there's kind of 4 stages to this. The pre-planning, which is really planning on how to manage a crisis. Then the triage phase is when that crisis occurs. The execution, of course, is accomplishing it, and then closing out and making sure your organization is back on track. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the phases. In the pre-planning phase, again, this is planning on how you manage the crisis. So some of the things you need to do is think about risk management. You want to have a plan to avoid further crises as you're managing that crisis. So how do you do that? How do you mitigate the impacts that we already talked about, the cultural, the organizational, the financial? Do you have a plan for that? And then if you have some trigger event that raises this crisis that you're in, what's your contingency plan for dealing with that? The second part is a structured response. Now, what I want to do is take us on a little different journey here. If you think about an emergency room, right? The ambulance pulls up, the stretcher rolls out with the patient on it, there's a response in the emergency room. It's very defined. That is, all of the folks and how they do things has been predefined. There's a person who's in charge. That's very clear right away. And then all the folks, what they do, when they do it, and how they do it is already defined. And you can see that there's folks who handle the actual crisis and folks who are handling the normal duties. That's all because of pre-planning. And so in order to do this, an organization should pre-plan on how to handle it. Now, once you get into the triage mode, this is when now you're into crisis mode. What do you have to do? First, align on the problem. Understand the actual problem to be solved. In the case of EUMDR, understand all the scope of the big ticket items, how many resources it'll take, what kind of money it will take. Write it down. Get that alignment from the team, get the alignment with management. This is going to set you up for success because you have organizational alignment. Now, the key elements for success in this stage, right? First, you have to have leadership. You have to have a solution leader who owns the problem and the solution. They're the point person. Underneath that, you need to have the right resources. They're dedicated to this. This is not one-off. They're not doing it as an add-on to their day-to-day. They're properly skilled. They know the crisis. They know the work that has to be done, and their roles are really well defined. On a communication perspective, this is absolutely key. You need to plan out your communication that you're going to use in this situation to make sure that everyone is aligned. Now, transparency and making sure that everyone sees exactly what is going on builds trust. Your communication needs to be consistent. Things change day to day. How do you keep people from getting delayed messages because they may not be correct? So how are you going to manage that? And then finally, your cadence in there, making sure that you have communication coming out at the right intervals. From a planning perspective, involve all your stakeholders. Make sure they're aligned. Think about your ongoing operations and how you're going to manage that while you manage the crisis. And then, of course, attentiveness to all the cultural aspects that we talked about. Be willing to iterate your plan as you go. You're going to be learning new things every day. When you switch to execution mode actually is not that different from when you're in an adaptive organization. The only difference is that it is much more urgent, much more focused, and you have to have the right skills to work in that environment. So absolutely disciplined execution with the right leadership. Fix the things that you can as you learn about them. You're going to need to disposition tasks that can't be fixed immediately because they will need to be fixed, and you need to think about when and how you'll fix those. When you think about keeping your team aligned, critically important during managing in the crisis mode, you need to apply change management and good communication. We just talked about that, very important during that time. And then finally, you got to make sure that you're really solving the initial cause for the reason you're in the crisis. Now, when you get to the response closure, you're not quite done. You've done your execution, but you're not quite done. It's really important to take the time and go, how did we handle this? If you have a crisis procedure, update those procedures with what you learned. Look at the issues that were discovered but not resolved, because those will probably move off to your regular portfolio of work, and you need to make sure those get transitioned. You're going to end up dealing with any collateral damage that has occurred. That also will need to be repaired. It may be within the crisis, managing the crisis, or again, moved off. And then you're going to want to communicate the changes across the organization so everyone is aligned on what occurred, what the resolution and the outcome. And then, of course, if your project portfolio has been affected, you need to adjust that and then reassign those resources. Now, I've left here with just a checklist that we have for managing crisis. You can look at that on your own leisure. And then I just want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, disruption can be reduced through early planning, the right strategy, and having the right leadership. Scott talked about the radar approach and how that can help you build that adaptive organization. Use that approach. Finally, if you end up being in a crisis situation, there are methods that you can use to help recover those programs. You have to have the right leadership, absolutely, in that case. And then finally, whether you're in adaptive or crisis modes, you have to have the right teams and processes. So building and maintaining those is absolutely key. Now, with that, I'd like to just close out. If you have questions, our email addresses are on the screen. You can reach out to either Scott or I. Thank you for listening this afternoon. It's been both Scott and my pleasure to be part of this conference.